This is Jerry Barrett talking. I'm interviewing Jerry Cosley in his office at Eastern Airlines in Miami. Today's date is April 23rd, 1986. Jerry, if you would, could you start by talking a little bit about what you did before you arrived here at Eastern, just by way of experience?
I spent 25 years at TWA, and had the opportunity to come to Eastern late last summer, early fall, when Colonel Borman offered me a position here, which coincided with the expectation that I was going to lose my job at TWA because of the Icon takeover, so it was kind of fortuitous.
Okay. So you have plenty of experience with the airline industry.
That's right. In fact, my first job at TWA was a ramp serviceman. So I'm a former union member. I worked my way up from ramp serviceman to now gloriously senior vice president of corporate communication. But once having left the ramp, all of my experience at TWA and subsequent was in corporate communications, PR, internal and external communications for both enterprises.
Okay, and that would include your responsibility here?
Yes.
Both internal and external.
That's correct.
As well. Okay. Can you talk a little about what you found when you arrived, by way of staff and problems and other things?
I found the two airlines to be very similar in terms of the people. Both the management staff, the senior executives, the rank and file people, contract and non-contract. Very similar in that they were very devoted to this thing. It was a red and white airline. Previously, here it was gray and silver and blue. But the very first impression I had was how wonderfully similar they all were, both in their devotion to the business, to their identity and dedication to this specific entity, and also the great depth of pain and uncertainty that they were feeling because of the trauma of deregulation. And not just deregulation, but in my view of things, it was also the trauma of change that was sweeping industrial America separate from deregulation. Union membership's expectations were changing and are changing. Management was groping for new roles and new tools and new ways to relate to people, totally separate from deregulation. I think deregulation brought a particularly sharp focus and pace of change, sped up the pace of change that all of American industry was going through, and in that sense, both airlines, and certainly this industry, represent kind of a laboratory, of a very human laboratory of how do you deal with the pain and uncertainty of accelerated change. And both airlines, in my view, were at about the same point in time, very disturbed, lines of communications shattered, not yet new lines of communications reestablished, a sense of a lack of trust. And I don't think it was really a lack of trust as much it was just confusion and uncertainty. The perfect, stable world had been knocked off kilter.
What in the world do you do about that, from your point? What did you try to do when you
You
got
need
here?
Time, and that's always an excuse you can use. Gee, if I'd only had more time. One other perception that caught me when I first got here was things were not quite as stable as I perceived them to be. Looking at Eastern from afar, having talked to executives here and having read news accounts about Eastern's recent history. I certainly knew TWA's recent painful history, but Eastern's painful history led me to believe that the recently won agreements, the increased employee participation, the union seats on the board, the employee stock ownership, that all of that had been a greater leap forward over the uncertainty to a new way of doing things than what I really then found. I found that the sense of having found a new direction was not as complete as I thought. And the longer, and I showed up here in roughly mid-September of '85, what I found was, A, that was not as much of a new direction that had everyone's commitment as I thought, and B, that the reason, and I still believe this to be true today, is because of politics. Both union politics and management politics, that inadvertently, because of the prior crisis, without really realizing what they were structuring for the future, everyone knew it was good, and for various reasons decided to get behind it. But then as they lived with it in the real world, they found imperfections and hadn't yet had the time to knock the burrs off of that, to test it, to work in a cooperative mode that this thing represented without outside influence, something coming in from the outside that would knock that off stride. It wasn't as far along as I thought it was, and I found immediately in the fall of '85 that indeed the worst possible thing was happening, which was still another financial crisis was going to test that new understanding before the roots had been put down firmly.
And you're saying that was, you found that on all sides of
All
the
sides,
question. Yeah.
all sides.
The organized employees, the
Exactly.
and in the management ranks as well.
Yeah, and it was not unique to Eastern in my view, but addressing Eastern, it needed, and still does, I think, a period of 2 or more years of relative stability, free from these compelling external forces of change and disruption, to allow these seedlings to really take root and become part of the ongoing culture of a new Eastern Airlines. I think the roots are still there. I think some of the foliage above the ground has been bruised and flattened by recent events, but I believe, just talking to people out around the system, that something very positive was started here. It's still alive. It's kind of underground now, and if circumstances, to the extent we can control them or have them happen to us, if those allow, this thing that was started will grow over time. I think it will grow faster if circumstances permit, but in my view, it's inevitable that the beginnings of the new culture here are still alive and are going to grow and survive the worst of us involved in the process.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. As an organization, the one that you run here within Eastern, what are you doing about this? How do you grab hold and try to? You can't control the external forces, obviously, but what do you do to sort of get that story told and get maintain some enthusiasm and build some trust?
Well, that's the most difficult process. Again, because external events just keep coming along and pummeling us. After we got over with we spend most of our time not building or helping build the foundation for the new house, but patching the concrete in the existing one along. We no sooner get beyond the last year and early this year's labor crisis and financial crisis, then we have a terribly demeaning FAA inspection of Eastern's maintenance policies and practices that just shakes not only public confidence in what Eastern's all about, but our own people. My God, I mean, just the simplistic allegations and the size of that fine, the worst ever, says to, and let's concentrate just internally for the moment, says to the people of Eastern that we're not any good. We're no good here. That then was followed by, most recently, by a Department of Defense reaction to that had them on the, just this past weekend, that had them on the verge of putting Eastern on a don't-fly list for Department of Defense personnel. Still another blow to the gut that says to Eastern people, something's terribly structurally wrong at Eastern. What we lose sight of, and I talk to my counterparts at other carriers and review industry data, is that we're really not, in my view, different or worse than another carrier. I think our operating reliability now is atrocious, and everyone in senior management knows it, and we know that it's going to take literally months to climb out of that hole. It's not something that and we've made some senior management changes in maintenance, one key part of the problem, not from a safety point of view, but from a reliability point of view. And those individuals, assuming they're the right ones, and I believe they are, it's going to take them literally months before their impact is felt on the maintenance piece of it, and we see some definitive improvement there. In the meantime, the employee reads in his daily paper that Eastern's no good, or there's a big question mark with regard to Eastern, and that where that reaches a bottom line for me is that it also says that management is either doing a lot of things wrong, or they're not doing some things that they should be doing, because it is, after all, bottom line, management's responsibility to fix these things. And where we are right now in communications, and I've said as much to Joe Leonard and Frank Borman, until, as managers, we can fix the operation so that not only the publicity or the customer perceives that Eastern is now once again reliable, clean, the airplanes look nice, our people perform well, but we convince our own people that, hey, we are still Eastern Airlines. We're a good airline. We have every reason to be proud of it and of each other. That the thing we started out to talk about, this cultural change and its ongoing survivability, really can't be dealt with credibly until we fix the known problems at Eastern Airlines. And then, having, I think, to a degree restored some of management's lost credibility, then we can start supplementing and bringing people's mind back to this germ of a good thought we had several years ago that's still here. Can we keep it free of politics, management or union, and allow it to grow, foster it, nurture it? That's what needs to be done. And it's very easy to say that. How to do it, how to control and shape the environment that would enhance doing it is a challenge I look forward to. And I can't really answer all the questions as to how to do it because it's a human interactive process. You don't sit down and devise a program in support of it. You have to see how the people on the line react to various initiatives. What are their perceptions? How would they like to see Eastern develop and grow? The old era, and I think that's really what's represented here, of management arbitrarily saying, hey, this is the way we're going, everybody get on board, is gone. It may be still around for a while, but one of the key changes that has to be made is management in its heart and gut believing in the principle that those people out there are committed, intelligent, worthwhile human beings. We say that, we write policy statements that echo it, yet on the line, day in and day out, if the employee sees managing in some other way, stinko, no credibility, and nothing's going to move very quickly. So the first challenge really is in management's lap, to change.
That's a hard thing to do, isn't it?
It is.
Because it's always easier to see the problem sort of in somebody else's arena.
That's right.
Sort of convince management at all levels that it's got to do something like that. It's a difficult process. Is that, do you think that falls within your responsibility, or is that more of a sort of an industrial relations problem?
It's both.
It is.
And it falls right in the lap of the chairman and the president and the chief operating officer, right in the lap of every member of senior management. I've often read that this kind of cultural sea change in any enterprise can only come about starting at the very top with your chairman.
Mm-hmm.
And then that group that reports immediately to him have got to be sincerely committed and on board, and on down through the various layers of the organization. If there's any gaps or inconsistencies in that, then it won't work, or it'll take longer to achieve what you're looking for. I think, and it's all under this broad heading of employee participation. Yet there are certain things where we still withhold information. Of necessity, for legal or proprietary reasons, we can't share information totally or in a timely way because of some of these concerns. I see my role as trying to help senior management develop, and the chairman, develop the kind of consensus in support of being an open, supportive, two-way street communications lash-up, so that this thing can resume growing, take some risks, communicate more rather than less. And if that gets us into a legal hassle or tells our competitors prematurely, so be it. That you can't go forward with this kind of evolution stepping back or being hesitant because of the risks. You've got to take some risks. And my basic philosophy is to err more on the side of openness and disclosure, accept those risks, in other words. Let's try it. Let's see if it works, rather than to sit here and say, well, we really can't or shouldn't do something because that would telegraph American Airlines prematurely. I happen to think we live in a fishbowl, and they're going to find out about it whether we tell our employees or not. So don't, those people out there who have to implement and perform day in, day out based on what we want this enterprise to achieve, if they don't know what the hell we're doing and what we expect of them, then we shouldn't expect much more than lackluster, inconsistent performance.
And you gain more by risking.
In my view, yes.
Because you build some trust, in effect.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
sharing information.
Yes. And it doesn't say you're always going to be right. If the feedback from back out there is you're full of crap, then we ought to really think about how well connected are we with the real airline. We sit up here in Building 16 looking at black books full of numbers that tell us how we're doing. That's not the real airline. And those numbers very often are anywhere from 30 to 60 to 90 days out of date. And we come across a declining performance in what we call PAWABs, passengers arriving without baggage, screwing up baggage delivery. So as senior managers looking at this black book with those numbers saying, hey, that's going to hell, we then jump on some poor devil in a staff meeting. He doesn't like getting his butt chewed, so he goes out and chews on the station managers. And these poor station managers sitting out there on the line, here, Building 16 wants the baggage numbers to improve. Now, he's got limited resources. He drops everything else, gets the baggage numbers improved, shuts Building 16 up and gets back to a normal life. And lo and behold, something else suffered as a result. And 3 months later, again up there in the ninth floor, oh, look at this, and we yap, and get all over everybody's ass. And we did the same thing at TWA. The answer to that, I think, is to quit reacting to these problem things that get out momentarily, and devise a broader kind of standard covering a number of areas where we say to a station manager, and says, hey, this, as long as you stay within this range, you adjust your resources, and I ain't going to yell at you if you're within the range and things are moving normally. Let him manage, him or her manage, in other words, as opposed to, and this is what I call management politics, where we attempt to control things from Building 16 by exhortation and yelling at people. And knuckle busting. With some people, you end up having to do that, but it's a different management style that gives not only the rank and file employee, but the line manager credit for his experience, knowledge, and dedication.
Those are hard changes to make, though.
They are.
Where you develop a management style of
Yeah.
looking at the numbers, as you said, and then shouting at somebody below you.
Yeah.
To do something like that, a significant change of sort of a management style or a way of managing, that can't be done either by just urging people to do it differently. Does there have to be a training, or what goes into that to make that kind of a significant change?
I think it does involve some training, and I think we got started on that before the latest crisis through the various employee involvement committees and groups. And when I first got here, I was pleased to participate in a couple of off-site sessions where an outside resource sat us down and helped us to get used to the idea of thinking differently about ourselves, our roles, what's motivating us. I found that to be a very interesting and helpful process. And yet here we were off-site, here in Miami, but in other words, you can't do this here in this building. So they dragged all of us senior managers off somewhere where they would have our attention. And lo and behold, being the action junkies that we are, we were popping in and out of the sessions, taking calls, urgent calls from our secretaries, or dealing with urgent operation sessions or problems. We would take breaks, and rather than discuss what we were learning or what the people were trying to lay on us, we were using the opportunity of having all of us together to have little ad hoc staff meetings about current airline issues and problems, entirely natural and maybe unavoidable. But what it said to me was that, boy, it's going to be a hell of a task to cut through all of the scar tissue and demands of being a manager of an enterprise like an airline in today's environment, to cut through all of that and get them to focus in sufficient depth for a sufficient length of time that attitude change can start to take place in their heads, which has to precede the cultural change that we're talking about having a more widespread impact. And I'm not sure the answer to that, except to keep coming back to that, and if necessary, take us out on a remote island, no radio, no TV, no newspaper, and most importantly, no damn telephones. And amazing, the airline will run perfectly well without us. We're not confident of that, and to the extent we are, there's some of us who probably don't want that too widely known. But it has to start with that kind of sharp psychological attitude, mind job on senior management. It's got to start there.
It's a good characterization, it seems to me, to refer to them as sort of action junkies, because successful people usually are very active, and to get them to not do that quite so quickly is a very significant change, and a difficult one to pull off.
The old, what was it, Senator Moynihan's, one of my favorite expressions that he uses is called benign neglect. The professional manager in today's environment says there's always something you should be doing about anything that comes up. They've not learned the fine art of laying back, seeing if the structure and the system and the people that you normally delegate to can't handle something. Again, it's that risk-taking of standing back, doing nothing, and seeing if we don't basically have a very strong core, resilient outfit here that can solve the problem without your having to direct the solution. That's very instructive in terms of developing management talent, but it's risky.
Yes.
It means they may screw up, and now you got a bigger problem to fix. So be it. If we are in fact action junkies, we've got to get out of this control mode, where we try to direct and control absolutely everything that comes before us.
someone has said to me, or maybe I've read it as well, that Colonel Borman is so good at anything he's tried and been so successful, and he combined with that is a genuinely helpful person. That is to say, he tries to help people.
Oh yes.
Where he sees a problem. That that putting those two things together caused the kind of overmanagement, to use that kind of expression, that you're talking about, and so it almost starts at that level.
It does.
This tendency to overmanage.
And it has as much to do with Eastern circumstances as it does Colonel Borman. I think if circumstantially the environment that he had to wrestle with had been shaped differently and made different demands, the perception of him and management at Eastern would be quite different. But we are all victims of this circumstance. I don't happen to think that Eastern is any less well managed than any other airline. But if you look at the circumstances that have confronted Borman when he first got here, and that senior management team, and the disadvantages that they had to wrestle with, they had precious little time for the kind of long-range planning and development and attitude changing that I'm sure they would support if circumstances had permitted. There was always this burning forest fire right in front of them that just obliterated everything else in the landscape. We got to knock that fire down before we can manage, before we can develop, before we can plan. Yeah. And that fire would get knocked down and another one would erupt. And that is pure circumstantial, or purely circumstantial in my view. And the fact that the management team hung together as well as it did is a tribute to Colonel Borman's will. He literally has held this airline together. Most people, in light of all the politics and propaganda of the recent trauma, to some degree ascribe part of the blame for Eastern situation, or much of it, on Colonel Borman, and they lose sight of the fact, and maybe my coming from the outside gives me a little more of a neutral perspective. I'm unalterably convinced that Eastern Airlines would not be here today. These people would not have the jobs and the benefits they do if he hadn't been here. Now, maybe some other guy could have, I don't know, but that's speculation. I just know that as I judge executives on holding impossible situations together and saving jobs, what he did was miraculous. Absolutely miraculous. No question in my mind. And I think typically, historically, it'll probably be sometime after the Borman era is done at Eastern before that can be fully understood and appreciated. It's sad, but that's the way it is in historical archaeology.
Somebody suggested to me that, just to focus on Borman for another minute or two, that because he has been successful in, circling the moon and other things like this, that make a hero of him in most of our eyes, that's part of his problem, that we place greater expectations on him. Right. The world does.
Absolutely.
The employees, the citizens, consumers.
Absolutely.
Then they place on you or I. And so if you then define your expectations accordingly on him, he can't succeed totally.
That's right.
But he's expected to.
That's exactly right. And the media fall prey to that. Our own employees, the executives that report to him, our employees, the media, the financial community. I'm glad you brought that up because it's incontrovertible in my mind. The poor guy could never live up to his expectation and made his job that much more difficult because somehow, and he has a very strong personality, quite separate from the hero astronaut test pilot image. He is in fact a very strong personality, and that too says that somehow he could or will or should accomplish more than the average human being. And when he only accomplishes as much or a tad more than what any rational person expects, somehow he has failed.
Yeah.
And
It's really ironic.
it really is, and it's very sad because I just don't know of anyone more devoted and dedicated to the very concerns that the rank and file employee at Eastern feel than Frank Borman, keeping them, saving jobs.
Mm-hmm.
He did it. Someday I think that'll be understood and he'll get the credit he deserves, but in this highly propagandized and politicized environment, it's not a story that's easily told.
Mm-hmm. One recent effort to sort of tell that story was the thing in the Boston Globe here a couple of weeks ago by John Simmons.
Yes.
Simmons,
I guess it is, yeah.
What did you think of that piece?
I thought it was reasonably on target. I don't recall much of it specifically now, but I do remember the feeling when I read it was about as close to a subjective or objective, balanced report on this whole affair as I had seen done by any of the various observers. Mm-hmm. It came pretty close in my view, and in fact, I don't think I took great exception to anything that was in it. I do recall that I had a sense of some things that were not in it or weren't developed as fully as I would have liked.
Oh.
I can't remember what those were.
Okay.
I want to go back and review the article, but I felt it was right on, basically, as I recall it.
Okay. You've referred a couple times to the politics on all sides. Mm-hmm. One of the things that occurred to me as an outsider, just getting acquainted here, is the relationship between the machinists, particularly Charlie Bryant, and Eastern Airlines has been one that's caught a lot of media attention.
That's
certainly.
Right.
And I've heard others here say that others within management say that Charlie Bryant has this sort of an oh shucks approach to the media that is that gets his story across pretty effectively, and that management has had a time wrestling with getting its story across in the light of Charlie Bryant's success.
Yes.
In kind of a old shucks approach to the public.
Yeah.
Has that been a problem? Because during even the shorter while that you've been here, he has certainly been at the forefront of problems December, January, February. Can you talk a little bit about that and particularly what you need to do to get your story also told?
I really think it doesn't have that much to do with Charlie Brown. I think that's an advantage. You know, Charlie does have sort of a down-home, easy-does-it kind of an approach, and I really think the problem in getting management's story across is the same problem every management has, which relates to this adversary relationship. It is management's responsibility to conclude an equitable contract in its view, and you can criticize whether its view is appropriate or not. And therefore, and this was true at TWA also, that when we get into these high visibility confrontations and disagreements, management's communications, its language, what it views as communications opportunities is vastly more constrained than the union side of the fence. The unions can say pretty much whatever they want, allegations, because you, management, got to come ultimately and deal with me and make a deal. So even though we have serious disagreements, the union is calling us names, accusing us of mismanagement intentionally or through incompetence, you name it, just about every headline-grabbing, colorful accusation you can dream up. It's part of the union arsenal, and they lob it into the game with great glee. Our responses to that, in the sessions where we said, "Did you see what so-and-so said? We ought to tell the truth, or we ought to tell our side." If you go back at them bare knuckle, it escalates the problem, and management has a sense that we're getting further from the ultimate solution. and this is sort of unofficial, people rarely say it, ergo, we have to take our lumps. And because ultimately, apart from the media spectacle piece of it, the charge, allegations, and all of this, ultimately, quietly, these guys know better, and they do, and they are going to make a deal with us. Because the union leader, this is something I want to come back to in an employee participation perspective, the union leader in a one-on-one session with Frank Borman or with Jack Johnson or something, is an entirely different animal than the guy standing up in front of a press conference saying, I got to have Borman's head. Now, we know that, but we never tell that side of the story. And the reason we don't, and it was the same thing at TWA, and I believe at most other enterprises, is he's the devil you got to make the deal with. And if you get into a pissing contest with a skunk, just for the media game end of it, that's going to lessen the likelihood of having the room at the last hour when it's always done, because everything else is BS. That lessens the ability to get the deal, and that's basically management's objective, not to win the media fight, who can be more colorful than the other guy and put interesting twists on statements, as much as it is to get the agreement. Now, that's a hellacious constraint on management, and it's very frustrating, and I'm very familiar with it, because I've always railed, let's tell the truth. Let's tell our side in blatant black and white detail. Well, no. And very often they'll say, you're right, we should. And then we'll draft the statement that says he is lying. And a labor relations expert will say, well, now, maybe we shouldn't do that, because we ultimately got to make a deal with this sucker. So there is a constraint on management that prevents it from speaking as well as it should on its own behalf. My reaction to that, coming back to employee involvement, is that the best answer, and I don't think I've proposed this to anybody, the best answer to that is to take the gamesmanship away from it. Take this whole nonsense of charge and countercharge away from the media. The media doesn't give a damn. They're not pro-company or pro-labor. They're pro-story.
Yes.
That's all they are. And if it's one of these slippery things that where Charlie Bryan in his all shucks down home mode can very cleverly take a shot at Borman's kneecaps and get away with it, that's all the media cares about. They're not trying to attack Colonel Borman. It's just Charlie's operating with a great deal more freedom than we feel we have. And the only way to change that, in my view, is in the context of employee participation. We've opened up the board of directors in those sessions. There's no great mystery there because we have union leaders sitting on that board. But what do the employees know about our relationship and contact and dialogue with union leaders? Only what union leadership tells them. And my answer to this, and I don't know whether it's doable legally or anything else, is that henceforth at some point we should say that any official contact with a union leader on this property will be recorded, either on tape or with a court stenographer. That you, the employee, deserve, if you want to know who said what to who, what was the deal, it's right there, it's documented. No more of this nonsense where the union leader can stand up and purposely distort the reality of the situation. In other words, if the average pilot could have had access to the record of the negotiations in Washington that nearly led to an agreement with the pilots in January of '86, everybody says we were that close to an agreement. It didn't happen. What then ensued was a humongous propaganda campaign by the pilots, a huge, extremely well done video conference that was a massive mind job on not only the pilots but the employees of this airline. And then finally, an agreement signed months later not substantially different than the one we almost signed in January. Why?
Okay.
If the employees knew, take the mystique out of that. If we're going to open everything else up for the employees, why don't we open up the management-union relationship to the point where it's a matter of record? You're not going to come in and say, hey, Borman, give me this, and I promise you that at the end game, when the contract's up for renewal, I'll work with you, and then not do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No more of that. That if they are intelligent, caring, dedicated people, why shouldn't they know what Charlie Bryan says to us and what we say back to him in the smoke-filled room? Why shouldn't they have access? What's to be hidden here?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to try that and see if that doesn't take the gamesmanship and the politics out of this thing, that we are all accountable for the outcome, Charlie and us. And the only way to do that in an honest way is to make a record of it, and that record is open and public, available to anybody that wants to see it.
I take it this is an idea you're toying with.
It is, and I haven't proposed it to anybody, but as I say, what's to prevent us, because we have the situation now where the IM is the odd man out in the helping to defray the labor costs of the company, that we're destined right now, if nothing else changes, to do the same thing all over again at the end of '87.
Hmm.
It will not change. Borman could be gone, and Bryan could be gone. Charlie Bryan gets hit by a bus, Borman retires after the merger and goes on to do something else. Two brand new guys, and I guarantee it'll be the same thing. Has nothing to do with Borman and Bryan. It has to do with the institutional, political orientation of both groups. And whether or not the unions will ever change, I don't know, but management, I think, has greater latitude to change. And the only thing I can think of that we could change that would have the kind of credibility we need, not trying to sell something politically, but just saying, there's the record. That's what was said, on what date, for what reason. This was our response, and this is how it evolved. No more doubts.
And the example you gave with the pilots is only one of many.
Only one. Borman tells the story that, and I wasn't here then, that I want to try to get my recollection correct, that when they signed the '84 wage investment program agreements, that the union leaders acknowledged that it was a temporary stopgap Band-Aid. Didn't solve the problem. And I believe the version goes that management emphasized, as we all understood, that we're going to have to revisit it. Now, when that turned out to be true, and Borman says, I got to extend the wage reductions from '84 through '85, what did the union leaders do? Foul, mistrust. He went back on his word. No, that's not. Now, if I'm being told the truth from the management side of the fence, and I don't know that I am, but if that's true, why did we let that happen? Mm-hmm. And the only thing that I can think of that would take that kind of political gamesmanship out of the picture would be to document every exchange of substance like that, so that the employees know what was said and what was promised, what was indicated. And that puts just as much constraint on us as it does the labor organizations. But until we take the gamesmanship out of it, then it's just going to be a battle of who's willing to invest the most money for the most colorful, flashy propaganda, and the truth is the first thing that gets lost. And that disturbs me greatly. Has for 25 years.
An interesting idea. It really is. It really is. Do you think that in your observations of the press coverage of not just the labor relations, but the whole story of Eastern, has that been relatively fair?
No, not really, but not because of any bias against the company or for the union or anything. There is, I think, a little bit of a natural bias where I think the media tend to view the labor unions as underdogs to some degree. And anything that, you know, kind of snaps at management heels makes good copy. But I really think the unions, having greater latitude, did a far more effective job of communicating than we did with the media. And I'm supposedly a professional at this. And I think, given our constraints, we did a very good job, but we didn't have as sexy a story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Our story was taking money away from our people. Now, how do you make that sound nice? That raises the question of economic understanding, and I think simplistically, most employees understood that. In fact, I've had IEM guys tell me they were more than willing, and in fact now a little feeling very awkward and difficult in that they're not participating. So I think the basic, after 7 years of deregulation, I think the basic economic understanding is there, but management had this horrible task of having the message is you're going to work harder for less. Now, that made the union's job very easy, which is to say, I am your defender. I will not let them do that. So that enhances their stature right away. It wouldn't my book. And they then, within, as I say, within the latitude they have, were able to raise these specious allegations of mismanagement and carry on a very effective propaganda campaign that we never effectively countered. Looking back over it, what would I have done differently? I think I would have argued more strongly for going bare knuckles. Forget this crap of ultimately we got to make the deal with Charlie. I've been around 25 years. I've seen us do that at TWA year in, year out.
Okay, we're back.
I'm not talking about keeping score, you know, management 25, unions 15. I'm talking about, and I make this assumption easily, if management is trying to chart the course that's greatest good for the enterprise and all the people, that's where it wins, is when it achieves those goals that are in fact best for everybody involved. The only way that management can win that is by dealing with these things differently, and I think they've got to be more bare-knuckled in its response. We've got to get off this idea that ultimately all these distortions can be tolerated because then Fred, or whatever the union leader's name is, really going to make the deal with me at the end. That's showmanship required only by politics that puts everything at risk, and that's got to cease. It's not unique to Eastern, the airline business. It is a problem in management or American enterprise. The need for new relationships, new ways outside the adversarial sphere for management and labor to relate to each other. I'm, like a lot of people, very interested in this GM Saturn experiment. Haven't heard much about it lately, and maybe that's good. Maybe that's good. Maybe that means everybody's keeping their mouths shut and are working together as opposed to playing mind games on each other. But my job is the media, and I don't like, from my management perspective, to use the media to do a mind job on our employees. It's distasteful to me. By the same token, I resent like hell when some other piece of our operation is doing it. I'm not sure what the answers are, but clearly, if American enterprise is going to thrive, let alone Eastern, then shaping new relationships with organized labor has got to be done. Management cannot wait for labor to do it. We've got to help them through it, and we've got to change ourselves.
The idea you just talked about it with Saturn, about keeping your mouth shut, that is one way of doing it. In terms of the situation here at Eastern, I'm just going to speculate here for a minute. If the idea was communicated to the unions, look, these are basically internal problems, and the external problems are a common enemy. Why don't we all keep our mouths shut to the press? And
We
and
tried
we'll solve
that.
it. Have you tried it?
Yeah. Sometimes it's forced on us because we end up in court or something, and the judge puts a gag rule on, or the NMB puts a blackout on the talks or something like that. And that's, in my view, that's preferable. That's preferable because it takes the propaganda out of it. Could we jointly agree on that and honor it? Probably not, because I think it's a very big tool that the unions have. They have a very difficult role to play in this day and age, particularly in this industry, where they no longer have the power and the ability to set wage and work rule conditions and benefits, that the marketplace now sets those. So they see their power being eroded by the marketplace, and the only thing they have to hold up to the people that elect them that says, I still have the power, because if I don't have any power, you don't need me here. The only thing I have is to structure these adversarial things, the allegations, the trust me, I'm acting in your best interest, and just generally fog the air with propaganda. The media loves it. It's very colorful stuff. Our response, given legal and other natural constraints, is much more subdued. We could join the game. We could be just as bare-knuckle and rascally as they are. I'm not sure that really helps, because now you can keep score on that. Charlie gets 25 points for being more colorful in the story in the Miami Herald than the Eastern spokesman. What the hell's that all about? We got an airline to run here, and not these crazy sideshows. I remember watching the pilot video conference. A number of things, very well done. I don't know whether you've seen it. 10,000 employees, I believe, 10 or 12,000 employees were audience to this very colorful, extremely well-produced thing. And I remember watching it, and about halfway through, I started to perceive that there was no information or fact, that it was all emotional, much like a political rally. And one thing stood out in my mind. There was a captain who was chairman of ALPA's finance committee, whose job it was, yeah, I'll be up in a minute, whose job it was to monitor the company's financial situation and report back to the membership. I forget his name, but he had the stage for 10 minutes to discuss Eastern's finances. And unless my memory serves me correctly, he did not mention any number once.
Oh my.
Not once. And when he concluded and said, thank you very much, on this satellite television conference, there was whistling and applause and placard waving of Borman must go. I said, wait a minute. This guy just did a financial study and didn't say shit. And yet, and that's the thing that scares me about my job or anybody doing these propaganda mind jobs on the employees. It's wrong. It's the wrong tool for the wrong reasons, and threatens the whole enterprise. And management, I'm sure, has been as guilty. But when we start playing with people's heads and emotions that way, and it's a natural part of the world, it scares the hell out of me. And that's got to change. And that thing about sharing the union dialogue and negotiations word for word with the employees is the only thing I can think of that's worth a try, that might put the game on a back burner. Because the game doesn't match the facts.
You have to go?
Yeah.
Can we do more later sometime?
Sure.
Okay.
You bet.
Well, let's call a halt to it here then.
Okay.
Appreciate very much your time.
Yeah.
And your
And I'm
candor.
fascinated by all this.
This is Jerry Barrett continuing an interview with Jerry Cosley. Today's date is April 24th, 1986. Could you talk a little bit, Jerry, about the events that took place in the early part of this year in connection with the sale of Eastern. I'm particularly interested in the kind of high drama that must have been taking place those last few days and few hours with the bankers sort of waiting on the sidelines, the three unions in some state of negotiations, and an offer sort of in the wind, the board of directors meeting. From an outsider's point of view, it sounded like high drama. Can you talk a little bit about all of that? Or?
It was indeed that. I go back to when we I first learned, and this was several weeks prior to that given the outlook in these negotiations and the terribly short list of alternatives, in other words, the outlook was that Charlie Bryan, the IAM, probably was not going to come to the party. In other words, participate, that union politics, the rhetoric that had preceded this endgame just gave every indication to management that no matter what happened, odds were that the IM, for political reasons, was not going to be able to come forward and agree to salary reductions and the other changes. Therefore, the only thing, if that then turned out to be the case, as management and the board tried to structure reasonable business-like alternatives, the alternative, the only other known alternative at that point, was to proceed directly into Chapter 11. The least satisfactory, the most onerous possible outcome, the one that management throughout wanted to avoid, and yet union leadership consistently accused us of using as a weapon. We couldn't ignore it, and in no way did we attempt to use that potential of Chapter 11 as a threat. It was part of the real-world fabric against which we were all pressed. Yet we were accused of using that as a threat. It had come up in prior confrontations and I think had been seen as a management tool and not something that was real. That was unfortunate, but that's what was going on. And when we then learned several weeks before this playing out that to maintain the best possible list of alternatives for the board and management, given this scenario, that would include selling the airline to another buyer, I think it was like a punch in the breadbasket. And I remember looks on management faces when we learned that we had directed our investment bankers to see if there were buyers out there. There was this almost imperceptible, but the senior management of this airline, you could just see by the look in their, almost dead look in their faces, slack cheeks, blank stares, shaking of heads of, my God, is it going to have to come to that? Then in that last week, when we learned that not only was that a bitter pill for us to contemplate as a solution to all of this agony, that in fact the only potential bidder out there showing any interest was in fact Frank Lorenzo, it was even more deflating. Nothing personal there with regard to Lorenzo or Texas Air. It was just that Lorenzo represented the enemy from a marketing, competitive point of view. He was one of the low-ball, low-cost guys that had just been busting our kneecaps, as people express. And the perception was, my God, we got to marry the devil himself to save our hides. Is that the way this thing is going to turn out? And again, that has nothing to do with his reputation as being a union buster or anything personal. It was just a business psyche had developed that he was on the other side of the fence, one of the bad guys that was really creating our problem. And that, my God, the solution would mean that we'd be propelled into his arms? You know, it was mind-boggling and disappointing. And it set us, and that sets a stage for very, very, as you say, high drama. I think most of us, and I also felt that even though our best information on the positions of the unions, their rhetoric, and particularly with regard to the IAM, that it was really going to come down to Chapter 11 or sale of the airline, I think most of us, and I certainly know I did, said, no, damn it, the numbers are so real and incontrovertible that politically the unions will have to play it out to the end of the game, but in fact all three, including the IAM, will find a way to deal with the problem, and we won't have to do either Chapter 11 or the sale of the airline. Yet that was wishful thinking, and I think I knew that. I don't know what was in the heads of the other senior managers, but my feeling was somehow it would turn out that way. Mm-hmm. It would be scary as hell. The tension level would be high, but if I was just patient enough and didn't really panic and jump to conclusions, leave a little room in my head to accept that as an outcome, that it would in fact happen. And as we went through that weekend, leading to the almost continuous board meetings on the subject, and we learned the details of the Texas Air offer, and that it was substantial and serious and very real, and we had not yet reached the agreements with the unions, that sort of wishful thinking in my own mind started to crack. And I started to see, particularly on that Sunday, that there was something inevitable here. We were all on a greased skid, Charlie Bryan included, and nobody had the intelligence or the power or the insight to change this, that some momentum of our history and circumstance was propelling us down this chute, and it was in fact going to end up in Lorenzo's hands. The meeting that night, as we went on through Sunday evening and on into the night, was bizarre at best. You had the board meeting in the auditorium of Building 16. The lobby outside was filled with financial, legal advisors, and employees just kind of hanging around, wondering what in the hell's going on here. So those of us who were not directly involved in the board meeting had this sort of comic opera situation where we're standing around in the lobby having chats with IEM representatives, legal advisors, and financial advisors about the weather, about what might happen, everybody playing their conversations very close to the vest and everything, but absolutely bizarre. And as the board meeting is going on, and they're in phone contact with Lorenzo, and I was not in those sessions, so I don't know what was said, but it's been fairly accurately reported, I believe, by board members and others who have described what happened in the boardroom itself. Nonetheless, the rest of us were like waiting for crumbs out there in that lobby as Colonel Borman or Mr. Bryan or a board member would come out and use the phone, or several of them would come out and step out onto the driveway and caucus and then go back in. We were reduced to trying to read the expressions on their faces, their body language. My God, what does that tell us? They'd then disappear back into the board meeting, and we had a new subject. What do you think that meant? Who were they calling? Is that a good sign, a positive sign? Looking at our watches, pacing around, drinking coffee, Danish, and just generally feeling absolutely helpless. When the deadline came, and I believe the first one was midnight, where Lorenzo's deal that we had to have the union agreements in hand and did not, we learned that Lorenzo had extended the deadline. The reasoning I heard most, and I think I subscribed to, is, aha, Lorenzo's a tough-nosed businessman. He would not have extended the deadline unless there was some reason that there was, in fact, as there always is, last-minute movement, and this thing is going to come together in the right way. That turned out not to be the case, as we subsequently learned, and as we had earlier predicted, that while the other two unions would ultimately come to grips with dealing with this problem, the IM could not. I leave it to others to interpret as to whether or not they really wanted to, but politically they couldn't, as a international institution and as a local. There was just no way politically that they could do it. And that, in fact, the airline was going to be sold at the next deadline if that didn't change. I think at that point, many of us, and the observers out in the lobby, myself included, and I know for myself specifically, I reached a sense at that point, I gave up the hope that it would go a more productive route, a more satisfactory route. And I said, it is in fact just a matter of time. And then curiosity as to how it will play out. In the meantime, there was still this constant churning and coming and going and caucusing and little mini sessions that would take place, to which none of us were privy except as secondary observers. And then towards the end of that evening, in the 1 to 2 a.m. time frame, as I recall, Colonel Borman came out and didn't say why he was not in the boardroom, but just kind of walked among the members of management that were out there and saying things like, don't give up hope, we're still working hard on this thing, trying to shore up our sagging spirits. He's remarkable in that regard. What we didn't know was at that time he had excused himself from the board deliberations, and while he was out there shoring up our spirits, the board of directors was in there voting to sell the airline, and he did not want to participate in that. None of us knew that at the time, and then he was called back into the meeting. Again, we didn't know what had happened, and we heard applause
When he returned?
when he went back in, and that signified something good. The board was in there applauding something good, and there was this resurgence of, my God, we gave up faith too early. This thing did work out. Something good happened in there. When in point of fact the board had decided to sell and was applauding Colonel Borman's courage, will, dedication, a vote of confidence for him as he returned to the room. It was then just a matter of minutes after that, I think it was both Colonel Borman and Dick McGurno, our chief attorney, came out. Borman called for everyone's attention and said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, I don't remember his exact words. I think it was reported in a story in the Wall Street Journal. I'm sorry to report that our airline has been sold to Texas Air Corporation. He then choked up, paused, his voice cracked, and he says, I'm sorry, I can't say anything more right now. Turned and walked to the elevators and went up to his office for a while to recompose himself. My own feeling at that time was, my God, this is insane. It has nothing to do with whether I liked Colonel Borman, but I had a sense of all he had put personally into this airline to avoid this, including whatever had happened in that room that night. And I was struck by his courage and his depth of caring, yet as a man, he didn't want to break down in front of all of us and went off by himself privately. And I don't know whether I would have had the composure that he showed. But it was there, very stark. We had sold our airline. And the reason for all of it was this political game that built up this tremendous back pressure and prevented the best among us from reaching through all the BS and finding a solution. And that was insane. This should not have happened this way. But there it was. And I think everybody was physically and intellectually wiped out. It had been a very long number of months. Those days and those hours immediately preceding that had just been an emotional ringer on everyone. My own feeling was how grossly disappointed and angry I felt that this kind of madness can take otherwise reasonable men and lead them to these irrational developments, was that I just didn't have anything more to give. I don't know how Colonel Borman, he had to feel, obviously felt a great deal worse. And yet I felt I didn't have anything left to feel. We'd all prepared so long for whatever the outcome that there was nothing left. We're just, out of gas. It was 2 in the morning, and God, what needs to be done now tonight? And we put out a brief statement to the media that took great pains to point out that the reason for the sale was precipitated because of the IEM's refusal or inability, whichever way you want to look at it, to help participate in a solution that would have avoided it. I didn't feel, after that, a burst of disappointment and anger and bewilderment. It dissipated quickly, and I just felt like an empty shell. Caring, feeling pain, disappointment didn't seem to matter anymore. It didn't add anything to the equation. It was done. So we just sort of mechanically structured a news release, and several of us stayed around for another hour, hour and a half in my department to call the media, wire services primarily, and say, here's our official version of what happened tonight.
Were some of the press in the room down, or in the lobby downstairs?
No, they were not.
They were not.
They were not. Yet, and this was another oddity, still not sure about it, in a subsequent Wall Street Journal, either that next morning, Monday morning, or the next morning, Tuesday, there was a very accurate blow-by-blow account of what was going on in the lobby and the boardroom. To this day, and the reporter was not there. So obviously someone in that collection, or perhaps several in that collection of observers and participants, took very careful notes and gave the Wall Street Journal a blow-by-blow of it. I have no problem with that, but no real problem. A little problem, but no real problem. In that I don't know why that happened that way. In other words, somebody knew that there was going to be a need to replay this in a very accurate way, albeit selective way, if I can make that observation, in a report to the media. And my suspicion is that that was fixed before that night, that the Wall Street Journal had made an arrangement with an observer or participant, or both, to make the kind of careful notes that would then permit the reconstruction of events as accurately as it was done. The thing that struck me about the piece was that what was in there was in fact accurate, but there were a number of events and facts that were not in the story that led me to believe that the person taking those careful notes was probably oriented to the Union side of the fence. So be it, so be it. No great loss there, but still it was one last bizarre twist to that particular episode.
You had gone through something somewhat similar to this in the at TWA.
Yes.
It had been sold in your last
Yes,
period
yes.
there.
And
Did you have a sort of a feeling of deja vu or something?
Very much so,
Yeah.
very much so. And the reaction of the people of TWA and the management of TWA was identical. The first was that difficulty of grappling that we had given up control of our enterprise to someone else, and then the uncertainty over the identity of that someone else and the changes that the new ownership might represent. But it was interesting, at TWA, Mr. Icahn made the original proposal, and then TWA signed an agreement with Lorenzo, the very same man. So I had a double whammy on deja vu. But it was interesting, and the same thing has happened here at Eastern. It was about 7 days, as I recall, before Lorenzo subsequently lost the bidding war to Icahn. But when we had a firm deal to sell TWA to him, it took about 7 days for the senior management team at TWA to get over that sense of loss, to look beyond that emotional reaction to the synergies of the combination, that we were in fact going to remain on TWA, that a separate operating entity tied to the parent, but still operating as TWA, but strengthened as a result, with new opportunities for equipment. Hey, we've been sold to an airline guy. And then there was this burst of enthusiastic support about, hey, it is not the end of the world. This guy's an airline guy. He's trying to make it succeed. If we do our jobs right, TWA's still TWA. I'm still in my job. If I'm incompetent, I'm gone. If I work hard, no sweat, and new opportunity. And there was this new burst of enthusiasm. Same thing happened here at Eastern. For about a week, A, we sold the airline. B, we sold it to that SOB Lorenzo, because he's from the other camp that had been giving us fits. But then it was almost like it's timed on a clock. People start saying, hey, have you looked at the size of the combined fleet, the size of the combined revenues, the access to new airplane potential? And all of a sudden that same shit-eating grin started showing up on faces around here about, hey, we're the biggest airline in the free world. Amazing. 2 months ago, we were walking around here like we were being browbeaten into the dirt by the mugging campaign that the unions were doing on us. Not running the airline, but spending almost all of our time fighting off this union problem. And that was a real joy to see. And it still exists today. There's an awful lot of uncertainties, but the senior management of any airline, I think, has to be a pretty resilient bunch, and they showed it here just as they did up at TWA. Once you get by the emotional reaction and start looking at the real world, start rubbing their hands and feeling a sense of new opportunity, which is in fact true.
That must have been a sort of an immediate problem for you and your office to begin to present that internally and externally as as not the end of the world, and in the best possible light.
Yeah, we did that. There was a little bit of a delay because after the sale, then we still had those. Well, the pilot contract got nailed down that night, but then we still had a number of days before the flight attendant contract came together. And then you have certain legal constraints and varying interpretations over the structure of the deal and what can you say and in what words with regard to the deal. So it was at least a week after the sale, I think, before all of us, Texas Air, ourselves, got our heads around not only a clear understanding of the deal we had made, but what our employees needed to know about it. What were they, how was it going down with them? What were they concerned about? What did they, first of all, need to know? And then legally, what could we say and in what terms? Because the last thing we want to do was to address the terms of that agreement in a way that was, first of all, has to be truthful, and second of all, that does not address the employees' real concerns. And I think over time, including a recent satellite conference we did, to the extent the law and legal advice permits us to be explicit about the terms of the agreement and their implication for Eastern's future and the future of our various employee groups, we've addressed that. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty on the part of the employees, particularly among union employees, or at least among union leadership, because of Lorenzo's mythological reputation as a union buster, which he is not, in my view.
Very early there were like joint interviews.
Yes.
With Borman and Lorenzo.
Yes.
Was that hard to put together?
Not really. The hardest thing to do was to get their schedules coordinated to the point where both would be available at a given time on a given day, and that schedule would stay in place for more than 24 hours so that we could tell the media that, yeah, it's going to be at 2 p.m. on a given day. Beyond that, there was really no complexity to it other than realizing the intense media interest was that it was going to be a zoo.
Yes.
A full house with them tripping over each other, and as always happens in a full house press conference, you got the print media banging elbows with the electronic media, jockeying for the best position and trying to outshout it, just like the president. Reagan's press conferences, trying to outshout each other to get a question in. And it doesn't really have to be a relevant question. It's just as long as Ernie Creel of NBC got his face and voice onto the record of the thing. But that's normal. There was really no difficulty about it other than getting the schedules to settle down to the point where we could nail it down, alert the media, and then coordinate their getting on and off the base to participate in it.
Was it done here?
Done here, yeah.
And they both were present here?
They both were present.
It wasn't electronic?
No, they both were present, and I saw a very interesting thing that day. I had met Lorenzo a couple times previously. I did not know him well. I'm not so sure I could say I know him well now. Had been enough time here with Colonel Borman that I felt I was beginning to know him. I'd spent maybe 15 minutes with the two of them together discussing the upcoming press conference and the questions that were likely to be asked. But I had no sense of how the two men related to each other. And we plopped them down on at a table loaded with microphones, a room full of high-intensity lights and cameras and barking news media, and these two guys sat down and, like they'd been brothers for years, handled things beautifully, passed questions back and forth, needled each other a little bit, and I just found that marvelous and reassuring, that here two men in whose hands the fortunes and livelihoods and futures of 41,000 Eastern employees were going to be held, related very comfortably, professionally, and in a very brotherly way. I found that to be a very positive sign, as opposed to one of them squirming uncertainly and the other assuming a superior, aloof mode, I am the buyer, you are the buyee kind of thing, which would be very, and I've seen that come across. But just I guess the word is chemistry between the two men, leaving aside the financial detail and all the complexities of this kind of a combination. That little bit of chemistry that I saw in that session gave me the greatest reassurance. That's two good men who are not going to beat up an airline because of something personal between the two of them. They got along very well and continue to.
Did they know each other before?
I believe they had met at various industry and social events where their paths crossed, but I don't believe, my impression is that they did not know each other well. Mr. Lorenzo has repeatedly, both in private and in public statements, just expressed the highest admiration for Colonel Borman and what he's achieved here. He's a businessman. He knows how difficult it has been, and he knows that the fact that this airline was here to be purchased in the way it does is because of the will of Frank Borman and holding it together. Otherwise, it would have been busted up and been on the Chapter 7 heap long ago.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Well, then following that, there was a need to communicate this to the employees. That event there that you just described was both inside and outside exposure.
Yes.
But a little bit later, wasn't there a opportunity for the employees to ask questions? And
yes, that was
a separate event.
Separate event, and it followed in about 30 days. We got a special issue of the company newspaper out dealing with much of what was known and what we could report, which appeared to satisfy the early concerns of the employees. But then about a month after that, or sometime into late March, we began to get reports from line management that the anxiety, things had quieted down, the merger was going forward, and we were back to running the airline. And there was nothing newsworthy in the merger itself. Nothing was happening other than it's following its procedural path. And it's interesting, I don't know how often I have to learn this lesson, that in the absence of information on a given subject, the employee grapevine, disinformation grapevine takes over. And we found that it was necessary and to come back and supplement that by having both Lorenzo and Borman participate in a employee satellite television conference. And unfortunately, only Colonel Borman could be live. We couldn't have Frank Lorenzo live on the conference because of legal opinion that says his participation in that kind of question and answer live conference would imply a sense of involvement and possible control of Eastern before the fact. And he was advised that he should not participate live, but did participate in about a 10-minute television interview with a neutral outside reporter who asked him the kind of questions that employees would have asked, I think. But it wasn't live, spontaneous kind of thing, which I think would have given it even more power. But the feedback we got from the total conference was that it helped a great deal. It did address the employee concerns that had evolved subsequent to the first round of communicating. But as I say, it's a lesson I have to learn over and over and over again. Since that satellite conference, I think there's now developing a need to come back out and update the employees on where we are. A regular, consistent status report. Anticipate their questions. Don't let the back pressure develop and the disinformation artists start filling in the gaps. Management's got to step up and handle these things on a day-in, day-out basis.
And really anticipate what,
That's right.
what the concerns are.
That's right. As you would with your own family. And we are one big family here. Although that word is overused and used in the wrong way, in my view. As it's a bit of propaganda, if you will, a little motivation bit. But in fact, we are a family. With a lot of differences, but a lot more things in common than the differences.
Which is like a family.
Exactly.
They have
Exactly.
differences.
Exactly.
This is a little bit of a digression, but the question keeps occurring to me as I talk to people at the airline who have been at other airlines. There's a good bit of that in this industry, that's
Yes.
moving from one airline to another. And it raises in my mind the question of sort of product loyalty, or how does that work for people, particularly at higher levels of management, moving from one to the other, where you have
It's difficult.
strongly advocated TWA, and now find yourself in the middle of a sentence having to substitute other nouns in there?
You got to be damn careful, number one, because just in my work, traditionally at TWA, I'd answer the phone. I'd not know who was calling, but I'd just say TWA Cosley. And when I got down here, I had to really strain to make sure I didn't say TWA Cosley when I'm answering Eastern's telephone. And for a month, I was perfect. I didn't screw that up once. Out of the blue, one afternoon, I was working late, it was 6 p.m., the phone rang. I have no idea who it is. It turns out to be Ed Meyer, the former president of TWA, with whom I had worked so long, who was calling just to see how I was getting along down at Eastern. And I picked up the phone and said, TWA Cosley. And he couldn't talk for 2 minutes, he laughed so hard. And when he finally could speak, and I says, but, he says, you're now going to try to convince me that that's the first time you've done that. I said, yes! And we had a big laugh over that. But it is difficult. You read about your former airline and colleagues and friends in the news media, and you're still connected to that emotionally and intellectually. The thing that helps is that each of these entities is so bloody similar. As I said in an earlier part of our interview, I was struck when I first got here about how much alike the people are. Even the engineers and maintenance look the same. Absolutely. Same haircuts, same way of dressing, the plastic pouch pocket full of pens and slide rules and everything. The senior management here, much like the same gang at TWA. It's a loyalty to the business. We're junkies for this business of air transportation, aviation, if you will. You don't, or at least in my own sense, and I don't think many do, you don't make changes casually. I know very few people in the industry that could just be lured from airline to airline by money. And that's a factor, of course. But there is, first of all, a tremendous love affair with the business, and it's common throughout the industry. And it's followed only slightly less strongly by an attachment to the enterprise that's yours, that you're identified with. And it says that the first part makes it easier to move around, but that second piece is quite strong. And for the better part of my career at TWA, I could not imagine working for another airline, ever. But then circumstantially, I had to consider that. And then I was pleased to learn that, hey, the same people are here, oriented the same way, motivated the same way. Their histories are quite similar. They went through hell at TWA, just, rocky earnings, course of earnings over the years. I felt right at home. And I'm pleased to have people tell me that I fit in very quickly.
You haven't really left home.
I haven't. I haven't.
Yes.
I haven't. Interestingly, though, your family pays a different price. It's very easy, because I'm pretty much doing the same thing I did at TWA. So it's a different color. Airplanes have different colors on them. Your family, though, when they make that move, and we move from Connecticut down here, they walk away from friends and connections and things. It's much more difficult on your family than it is for us, because we got our work to occupy us. But fortunately, airline families do quite a bit of moving. I worked in Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Kansas City, and New York before leaving TWA. So, and much of that married with children. So we were used to. It was about every 6-7 years I'd get promoted or pushed out of the nest in some way to move on. I wouldn't change any of that. But they were used to that kind of transition.
More mobile
than a lot of people, yeah.
Yeah.
Not as bad as IBM, I don't think, who move people around even more frequently.
One of the things that I'm curious about in the period since the sale, has there been a real problem with the relationship with the IAM and all other employees? The report that there was an assistant that Borman resigned as a price for joining the party, and then they never did come to the party. And there had been some even as early as '83, some straining between the pilots and the IAM, a feeling that the pilots gave up something, and then what they gave up was then given to the IAM. Has that been a continuing problem from the point of view of you're trying to communicate even-handedly with the employees, keep a positive message in front of them?
Well, yes and no. It's a problem in that we're all aware of it. At a fairly low level, or not too frequently, I'm pleased to say, there are little incidents that you hear about where there'll be momentary confrontations between employees. And I've heard, in fact, I witnessed one where on IM payday, an IM employee would waive his full pay check stub at some non-contract acquaintances, and I got mine. That reflects more on that individual than the IM. That's not a cultural IM thing. In fact, most of the IM people I've known at TWA and Eastern are just outstanding people, rank and file, and some of the union leadership too. The problem here is an institutional problem, not a personality problem.
Okay.
It's an unfinished bit of business, if you will. When you go through that kind of trauma, you'd kind of like to reach some sort of conclusion and say, all right, for better or worse, This is where we all are. Now then, collectively, let's get our act together and move on from here. 99% of us are in that boat, and the unresolved IAM question is like a ball and chain. It is an inhibitor. It's not in neon lights with a lot of noise, but everybody knows it's there. It's just kind of stuck behind your ear, and you kind of scratch at it every now and then. It's always with you. It's always unresolved, and therefore a definite negative. But by the same token, I don't see anybody in this airline using that to stop us from doing what we need to be doing, which is getting our operating reliability back up to par, delivering the product to the customer, managing, getting at the things. We all know it's there, but it's an aggravation, and it's an inhibitor. But it is not stopping us, real world, from doing what we need to do. The airline is, in fact, moving on, not at the rapid, cohesive pace that we'd like because of it, but it's still there. And it's not just the IAM. Even the TWU had a bit of mischief to play with refusing to, when you think that's all wrapped up, they then refused to count the ballots for ratification of the contract because of an alleged dispute over the contract terms. Totally unnecessary, totally unfounded from my view. And yet here again, as we attempt to move on, there's this mischievous, negative, problem, it ain't done yet kind of feeling. And you get the feeling like you're walking through molasses, that you're never going to get out of the muck and get back to the business. And then here most recently, the papers were filled with stories that all three unions are now talking to a third party to possibly come in and make a competitive bid, stop the Lorenzo buyout, in other words. So you begin to wonder at Eastern Airlines, are we ever going to get unencumbered by this adversarial crap? And the reason it's there has nothing to do with personalities, Frank Borman, Charlie Bryan, Schulte, Callahan, or any of that. It has to do with my basic core concern, which is, and it's not just at Eastern or the airline business, but this necessitated adversarial relationship between management and labor. That somehow that's got to be cracked and changed. As long as it is accepted as part of your dues or the natural way of things, then I don't look for things to get a hell of a lot better anytime soon. But if we start out every day saying we are adversaries and are going to be at each other's eyes, what the hell can you expect other than what we're suffering? Mm-hmm. Having gone through a huge trauma, we're still being held back by these tailings of negativism and adversarial relationships that the only purpose they serve is the political need of a union leader, and we helped create this in management. You know, I'm not blaming them. You know, we built this house together. That they have this political need not to be perceived as working with management, but working on behalf of their members, which means management is the enemy. They're doing things wrong. They're not doing what they should, or they're not doing enough. They're screwing things up. It's them against us, and they don't dare let the environment quiet down to a cooperative, peaceful, constructive process. It's not in their political best interest.
One other event that I've noticed happening here recently is the organizing by another organization, which just sort of adds to the noise in the system, doesn't it?
And that's still another new ball and chain, slowing us down. Management spends an inordinate amount of time dealing with these kinds of issues and not running the airline.
Can you talk a little bit about what role you saw USRE playing in all of this during the period you were here?
I'm not sure I have a name for it. senior counselor, or I don't know. The man brings not only his, God, what is it, 30, 40 years of labor relations experience on both sides of the fence, but he brings, in addition to however valuable that is, and that's got to be immense, he brings a people sense that I've found rare. He's got an ability to advocate something without being an identified advocate, of throwing an idea out onto a table and keeping it alive. He knows where he wants to be. His experience, his savvy, his people sense says, as I hear all of this, my bottom line is the group ought to go through that door. And the group's got 12 senior managers at Eastern, and they want to go through one of 12 other doors. And I've watched him across meetings without saying, that's the only door you dare go through, help them think, inject ideas and considerations for their good minds to mull over, and lo and behold, everybody walks through Bill's door. Not at Bill's orders, but because he helped them, and that's, I guess, why he's a good mediator, is he helps them perceive what they need to be dealing with in order to make the right decisions without ramming it down their throats. And that's a unique ability. Takes great patience. Man's got a hell of a lot more patience than I do. But I used to sit and listen to him and watch him. What the hell did he say? And that it took me a number of months of working with him throughout this period to realize that that was intentional on his part. For him to take any more direct route would have been to try to force people in a direction, and the natural human reaction is to resist that. So he's remarkable. But his role was as a senior counselor to the board and to senior management, bringing his wealth of experience and knowledge and helping us sort through the options and make decisions and decide on courses that had some reasonable expectation of being, if not successful, at least the best course.
During most of that time, it sounded to me as if he was able to maintain reasonably good relationships with the three unions involved.
I believe he did, but he's a smart man, and he also kept that out of our view. In other words, at his most vague, he would be referring to his relationship with the unions. In other words, he'd say, I've got some thoughts along that line, give me a couple days to pursue it. What he was saying was, give me a chance to talk to, say, Peter, Paul, or Brian privately outside the formal structure. And I don't know of anybody that, at least in our group sessions, that quizzed him as to who you're going to talk to, what you're going to do. We all knew he had good relationships and entrees in the high houses of labor, and he was left to do that. Mm-hmm. But he was necessarily, and I think appropriately, not explicit with regard to what he was doing and when and why. Because then he's becomes nothing but a simple messenger boy, running back and forth between the two camps, and so he kept a certain air of appropriate mystery about all of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that protects his relationships with them. If they felt that he then came back from those meetings and reported chapter and verse, as he must have, let's say, with Colonel Borman, of necessity. But for the full group of senior management, and we're all a bunch of gossipers, I don't think it would help his ability to maintain those relationships to come back and spill his guts about every bit of nuance from these relationships and conversations. But as far as I know, he walked that tightrope beautifully, from everything I can determine. It's amazing. I don't know many people that can do that.
One of the first things that I knew about Eastern as an entity through observing the television was Frank Borman commercials. Mm-hmm. Is that a real asset to the organization? It affected me very strongly in a very positive way.
Yeah.
Him doing it personally.
I think depending on the personality and ability of the CEO to do that kind of thing well, yeah, it is an asset. There are some CEOs that shouldn't do that they're not comfortable in that kind of an exposure, and it comes across, and it says, I'm the head guy here, and I'm uncomfortable. Whereas Borman comes along or comes across much more confident, at ease, not showbiz perfect. I'm not talking about that, but he just projects an air of honesty, conviction. I am of this business. I am personally, in my soul and gut, identified and committed to it. That's a tremendous positive. Quite apart from the message of the low fare or the news service or whatever the ad guy's having selling at the moment. Just his natural, instinctive connection with aviation and the business in his prior career, I think, was a boost to Eastern. And it says the head guy is not afraid to come out of the office and stand up there and take the heat, because on airplanes, he's immediately recognizable, and anybody that's had their bag lost or airplane canceled out from under him or something is going to, hey, Borman, come if I got an earful for you, So there's pluses and minuses, both from the enterprise's point of view and for him personally. But I really think he liked doing it, because it was still another way for him to exercise his will on behalf of these 41,000 people, to help them. And he would not do it if he didn't feel that it was helping him.
Is that mostly taken care of by an ad agency?
Yeah.
The text of that, the setup,
yes.
whatever else goes into such
yeah. And my department's relationship with the advertising department is very close, to the point where we don't put out any marketing-related news releases that they don't sign off on. By the same token, they don't put Borman in situations without, like that, public exposure situations, without our involvement and consultation. So we work very closely together on that kind of thing. And that was true before I got here. So.
Oh, it was?
Yeah.
Have there been any changes that you've felt the need to make after you arrived here in the area for which you have responsibility?
No, in fact, I pledged that I would not. I viewed coming down here as that these people were solid professionals or they wouldn't be here. We didn't know each other, and that I would allow myself and them at least 6 months before I would make any substantial change, unless there was just a very obvious, painful necessity to do so, that somebody wasn't competent. But I found the staff here to be immensely dedicated and competent. I am, right now, as we talk some 7 months or so later, considering some minor realignments of the department. Because I've now got a chance to determine the strengths and weaknesses of each of the individual players in this department. And I don't envision anyone leaving the department, but just moving in terms of responsibility and having a little more clear definition of their task, kind of thing. So a minor reorganization I am only now considering.
Oh, yeah.
But based on experience.
Did you know McGraw?
Not well. I'd only met him once before agreeing to take this position. So he's not somebody I know well.
I had interviewed name slips, Bob
Christian?
Hunter.
Bob Hunter.
Bob Hunter. Well, part of my discussion with him had to do with raising questions about where the function he was performing really belongs. And I wondered whether is that a factor? The discussion went to the question of, does that communications with the employees and about the cultural atmosphere in which they work and live, does it belong in communication, corporate communications, or is it more appropriate in human resources? And is that a remaining question, or is that fairly well resolved?
It's not a currently live question here, Eddie. And in fact, it's not a question that has come up in my tenure at Eastern. I am one of those, and I'm not an empire builder. I think depending on the overall structure of the corporation, it can function equally well in either department. I don't think it of necessity has to be in corporate communication. I think that's a logical fit. It is, in fact, a communications function. By the same token, internal communication has to be so closely linked to the human resources aspect because of policies and inter-employee group relationships and things, that it requires that if that individual is in my department, that he has to have the very closest working relationship with human resources in order to do it well. By the same token, if that individual were in human resources, they'd have to coordinate very closely with us because of policies and corporate goals and things that have nothing to do with human resources or not directly on their task list. So I happen to think it fits most logically in corporate communications. The kicker is how good is the individual that heads that line of work, and how good do they maintain relationships with the departments that they have to coordinate with. If somebody came in here tomorrow and made the case that they wanted to take internal communications out of this department and say put it in human resources, the only concern I would have would be how well are they going to do it, and then the coordination and everything. Because you can do it equally well over there as here. It depends on the people, the commitment to coordinate, and if there's any bullshit of empire building that Jack Johnson say just wants a few more people and is grabbing and that kind of crap, then I wouldn't have any care about it whatsoever. I would resist it. But as long as it's an above-board, logically supported move, and in fact the communications with the employees doesn't suffer, I'd consider it easily.
The reason I picked up on that is yesterday you talked a little bit about the need really for some kind of a cultural shift within the organization, and particularly at the managerial level, in the way in which they do business, and the way in which they place more trust in employees and encourage participation. And it seems that function there, that internal communication, very closely tied to many of the things that are employee involvement program, for example. But the way you described it, it can work either place as long as there is.
And the most important part of that is not the communications piece of it. How committed are we to employee involvement as an entity?
Yeah.
If that's not there, then the slickest communicator in the world is working fantasy. You may do the best job credibly, and the employee looks around his shop and he says, I don't see no employee involvement. That sucker that I work for, man, he didn't want that shit in here.
Okay. Yeah, they look at the behavior.
We sometimes, it's the old Marshall McLuhan thing, we get into the medium as opposed to the message, and you got to do these other things first. And then I don't think it wouldn't matter if that communicator was a part of the legal department, although I would hate to see that. Now that I would fight.
Yeah. I follow that very well.
They're so damn cautious, of necessity, given their background experiences. Don't say anything, Don't tell anybody anything, because it might put us in some legal risk.
During these past 7 months, just to cause you to kind of reflect on your own life and experience here for a minute, have you ever thought to yourself, boy, I should have gotten some kind of retirement arrangement and gone and written a book or something instead of getting into another mess? That has occurred to you?
No. What has occurred to me is that I'm tired of it. One of the main attractions that caused me to come down here was, as I think I said in an earlier part of an interview, an incorrect perception that somehow they had moved beyond what we just went through, that was not going to happen again. And that was naive on my part. Nobody at Eastern misled me. That was my own interpretation. I did that to myself. So there is a strong, deeply rooted disappointment in me that that Eastern had not moved beyond that, and that disappointment relates more to it's going to take longer to get to those things that I'd really like to be doing, as opposed to playing fireman because of all the mischief makers in the organization. I.e. employee involvement, improving the quality of the airline, seeing it grow and prosper. I wanted to be a part of that at TWA. We never got there. I felt that at Eastern they were closer to it, and wow, finally we can talk about communicating in an environment where there's a more cooperative attitude of working together, a family, that most of that BS had been left behind. Greatest disappointment is to find out, boy, in spades, that was not the case. But where that leaves me intellectually is, all right, it's still sitting out there, the opportunity. The challenge is just as great, if not more so than it was at TWA. And you don't whine about things like that. You get to work on piece by piece getting there. Not just in terms of communications, but in terms of trying to be a catalyst, a facilitator in helping management do the necessary structural pieces of it, so that when you communicate about it, that it matches what the employee sees in his real world. If there's a mismatch there, then I don't care how good you are as a communicator, it stinks. You're wasting a good communications resource.
You didn't make a mistake then, coming.
No,
I guess that's what the question was.
No, I don't think I did. I don't think I did.
Bad career choice.
As I get older, I'm getting, a spiritual side of me is growing a bit too, and I happen to think that maybe God intended me to go through this mess one more time as a test of my character and spine, I guess. I don't know. Or more fateful outlook, I guess. But I just think there is a great airline here. If it can ever get out of this internal machinations and start acting like it. It's all here. The pieces are all here. The people, the facilities, the equipment. But we've been locked now for, a decade this enterprise has in this politically motivated intramural debate. And that is so unproductive.
And 10 years is a long time.
It is.
In most people's career.
Yeah.
And so I imagine there's a goodly number of employees here who have heard that message, whatever the message is, for all of their career here.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they get sort of jaded after a while.
That's right. That's one of the toughest things, one of the toughest tasks I have is, because as much as we are alike, there is something unique at Eastern because of that, the intensity of that over this last decade. That's done something to people's heads here that I didn't go through. Mm-hmm. I mean, something similar to TW. It wasn't the same thing. And one of the toughest tasks I have is gaining the confidence of individual employees that I'm pleased to run into, to get them to talk and share what they feel and think as a result of all that. Because I need to understand that desperately, and I do not. Mm-hmm. I do not.
Yeah. You've not lived through it here.
And it's almost like talking about a death in the family, as I try to open that door in a conversation over here in the cafeteria with somebody in the IM or something. They don't want to talk about it. Well, that's the way it always has been. Just little verbal shorthands that says change the subject. They don't want to talk about it. And yet I need, if I'm going to do an effective job, I need to understand that much better than I do. What has it done to people's expectations and their psyches and outlooks? I know it's nothing good. There could be something potentially good in it, and there's a toughness and a resolve. If they're still here,
yeah,
and that means, boy, they're committed to something. And down under all of that, the weight of all that negative, there's got to be some hope and a tremendous cooperative wellspring. And if you could tap into that, I'm looking for that path through that scar tissue to let that out. Mm-hmm. And that's where I come back to a employee involvement thing that we work just as hard on that as we do on on-time performance. And that there is, in fact, limitless potential here. But employee involvement has suffered because the managers that are supposed to be involved in it are distracted by all this negativism. We just never get that period of stability where we can get the airline running and then say, all right, now let's make this work. And have an expectation that things are going to stay relatively free of the acrimony for 2-3 years at least, so you can plan something, as opposed to 6 months later having a negative bomb drop in and just blow it to smithereens.
The article in the Globe that we mentioned yesterday, it talked in terms of two factors that were needed. One was time and trust, and it was saying maybe there wasn't enough time, maybe there wasn't enough of either. And that's a little bit what you're alluding to. If you had this space where the external things weren't pounding you around, then that manager who is not yet willing to have his employees participate would have the
I agree
luxury
with
of the time to do that.
And the trust piece of it troubles me. Because in my view, there's no reason for a lack of trust. And the only reason trust has been called into question is part of the adversarial, politically motivated, negative spin that's put on everything. But that when you get back to a factual base of who said what, who did what, I cannot find a breach of faith, at least on management's part. I really can't. What have we done wrong or differently that is in fact a breach of trust, except that which, for political reasons I surmise, certain union leaders have said is a breach of trust? And in saying it's a breach of trust, they put it in the context of something that's not factual, i.e., as I'm told, and I'm admitting now that I only get the one side of it, which is Frank Borman and Jack Johnson and others who told me what happened down here in 84, 85, that everybody agreed, again, in the smoke-filled room, all that pressure and intensity, that this 84 wage investment plan was at best a Band-Aid, and let's not kid ourselves, in 85, odds are we're going to need to extend it or maybe even add to it. You got it. We'll work with you. Then when we got to that period, instead of working with the man, they went public, breach of trust, mismanagement, and the whole thing started all over again. That doesn't mean they're bad people, but what it does say to me is that for them to say anything else was political suicide. So I think that the priorities are, we've got to have a period of time so that we can work out new relationships that don't require that kind of political response. Then maybe we've got a chance, because once that starts, once that accusation's in the air, even though management says, hey, wait a minute, the negative spin is on the ball, and that's got just too damn much appeal and momentum to it, especially when what management is saying is still less. I'm not going to restore your salaries. I can't. For the good of all of us, I can't. Each of those labor leaders then goes down and puts, depending on his organizational orientation, puts his own political spin on it. The thing in common is that son of a bitch did it to us again. And yet a year before, he was not a son of a bitch. They were trying to come out of a negotiation with all of their hides intact, managed to do so, acknowledged that it was a patch that might not hold, and yet when it came time to be a statesman, they were unable to do so. And I don't think it's so much a matter of unwilling, and I'm speculating here, I don't know. They're just unable, circumstantially, to do what's best for the enterprise.
Given the environment that they get elected in and have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
And I often wonder, they say the constitution of these, of the membership of labor organizations is changing dramatically. They're younger, they're better educated, have different expectations. Yet these are the people they elect for those very reasons. if somebody was to come along in an IM election to replace Charlie Bryan, he would not be lobbying on a platform of closer cooperation with management. Charlie's too weak.
Yeah.
I'm going to stick it to those sons of bitches. There ain't no way they're ever even going to raise the subject of a salary cut with me. Now, that guy might get elected.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problem, too. What do the members want from their leadership?
Yeah.
If they want a continuation of this annual agony, then keep electing these guys that come to work with chainsaws as part of their tool. And then they shouldn't be too surprised, no matter what that individual is like as a human being, they shouldn't be too surprised if politically they have put him or her in a position where all he can do is rail at management, fog the air with these phony allegations, and poison the traveling public's mind to the point where they're not so sure they want to fly Eastern, because there they go again. And it's just got such an automated, tired smell to it that I just, God, there ought to be another way, which relates to the other thing I was saying, that the only chink I can see that, or hole that might be poked into this, that might have a potential for changing it, is to somehow open up the dialogue with the union to the point where it ain't a secret anymore.
Mm.
Whereas if they'd yelled foul in February of '85, we could have played the tapes from March of '84, wherein they fourscore pledged that, hey, we'll work with you. That's the only thing that would remove that game. And an awful lot of things and that trauma that we've gone through as a result would not have happened.
Yeah. If the same speeches were given in both places, the
That's
same
right.
conversation
That's right.
took place in both places.
Or at least that everybody knew that there was a record in a vault somewhere that that either side could haul out in the sunlight and play to keep the other one honest. You know, I don't know. I can't think of anything else. The only other thing is to wait for the slow Darwinian evolutionary process to take place, and I just don't think Eastern as an enterprise has that kind of time. We've got to break this cycle, and I think it's up to management to break it sooner rather than later.
I think I'm going to quit at this point. I've taken a lot of your time, and
Okay.
I really appreciate your willingness to talk.
I obviously have very strong feelings about that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.